Angel. It's so great to have you here again. After our chat a couple of weeks ago, many of our audience actually wrote to us and see if we could invite you back on the show again to discuss impeachment, which is the most interesting and controversial topic politically right now in the United States. So, when I personally think about impeachment, I still cannot get over the fact that this is a second impeachment in only 13 months and only the fourth time in the American history.
Right.
So, and what's even more extraordinary about this round of impeachment is it will actually be the first to occur after the president facing impeachment, in this case, Trump, has left office. And that's quite controversial in and of itself. And, some lawmakers and even constitutional scholars question whether, putting a former president on trial is even constitutional. But, I guess the foremost question that we want to get your answers on is, if we think about impeachment as a way to remove a president from office, Trump is being impeached post-departure from office. So what would be the justification, or what's even the point of impeachment in this case?
So, hi, Lizzie.
Hi.
Great to be back here again today. Thank you so much for having me. Getting right into the meat of your question, and it's a great question because this is an unprecedented impeachment since Trump is set to leave office in a few days, like you mentioned. And to be clear, the Senate trial, McConnell said, would not likely happen until after Trump leaves the presidency, January 20th. So we're in uncharted waters right now. So your viewers might be wondering, what's the point of impeaching Trump given the fact that he's leaving so soon? So we have, on the one hand, the argument can be made that there are only a few days left in Trump's tenure, and as president, impeachment might be like too divisive for this country, like I mentioned last time. Trump is leaving the office anyway, so why are we burdening the country with an impeachment proceeding that will take up resources during Biden's first 100 days, which Biden himself says he needs Congress to focus on confirming his nominees for top administration positions. On the other hand, in my opinion, the better argument to be made is that the timing of Trump's imminent departure to the White House and the end of his presidency should not determine whether or not he should be impeached. Because if we look about it this way, if any other person allegedly commits a crime of murder, let's just say, right, the most heinous crime, and moves to another town,
Right.
does that mean we should stop pursuing this alleged criminal because he or she moved, right? So that's the kind of line of reasoning that many of us are following, on that side of the argument. So therefore, I believe that impeaching Trump is definitely the right thing to do for three reasons. So first, to establish that this is a country governed by the rule of law, to show that there must be some consequences for breaking this country's law, especially insurrection, like you saw, right? No matter who you are or what position you hold in this country, you must be held accountable. Second, to set some sort of political precedence, because impeachment, and we can discuss this later, is not a legal proceeding per se. It's very much inherently a political decision. And I'll get into that later, to explain that to your viewers. But basically, we don't want this kind of violent insurrection to happen again, even though, historically in American history, it's not uncommon. The scenes unfolding at the Capitol were definitely alarming, but, throughout US history, there's always been, violence and, insurrection and just not necessarily just not necessarily. I don't know. I mean, we didn't have streaming, and we didn't know how bad it was back then, but we just know that this isn't the first time. So yes, we must show that this type of violent insurrection cannot be tolerated in this country. And third, and the most important, is perhaps if we get a conviction for this impeachment, which is possible, and we can discuss that later, it would maybe disqualify Trump from holding future office.
Right.
A successful conviction may mean Trump would lose many of the privileges presidents, have enjoyed in the past. Though I've been reading that if an impeachment proceeding happens after the president has already left the office or resigned, that's off the table. They get to keep their privileges, which I didn't know. I think that's a new thing. So I think the disqualification is the more practical, way of viewing this impeachment, keeping him from holding office ever again. And I think you have bipartisan support for that too, because you hear Trump thinking about running for 2024. You have all these other Republicans that want to run for 2024, so there might be more support for that. So to my first point, even with a few days left in his office, it still makes a lot of sense to impeach Trump. And the sense is to show this country and the world that this president or any future president who incites insurrection against his or her own government for his or her own chief political purposes, that act will be severely punishable by law. To my second point, it is especially important to impeach Trump the second time from a precedent-setting perspective, since, like you mentioned, there's only been 4 impeachments. So there's not much precedence at all. So, this would help provide future guidance to Congress on when to impeach the president. Because if you're not going to impeach the president for inciting violence to overthrow a Capitol or to, this insurrection, what else can you impeach a president for, right? So if we don't do it now, the argument can be made down the road, well, hey, you didn't impeach Trump and he did this awful thing. Like, why would we impeach this, president, 10 years down the line for something, something else? So we don't want that to happen. So those are like my 3 points, and my third point being the most practical of all. So that's pretty much my view on it.
Yeah, it's a really comprehensive answer to my first question. But as you alluded to in your answer, the idea of impeachable crime or impeachable offense is actually a little vague. In this time we see the House of Representatives actually accused Trump of encouraging violence with his false claims of election fraud. If you look at the articles of impeachment, it says incitement of insurrection over the Capitol riots. So what actually constitutes an impeachable crime? And when the impeachment trial actually takes place in the Senate, later this year, who knows when that's going to be? What arguments the two sides are likely to bring forward, both for and against impeachment?
Okay, so that's a great question, and that's what I wanted to touch upon before. So to better answer your question, let's first briefly talk about what impeachment is and what impeachment isn't. So in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, the United States Constitution provides that the House shall have sole power of impeachment and that the Senate shall have sole power to try the impeachment. And Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution requires 2/3 of the Senate to convict a person. So the US president, the vice president, and US civil officers, they're all subject to impeachment. Therefore, the decision to impeach is a matter of a political decision and not a legal decision. The decision for the House to impeach a government official, such as the president and the Senate's right to carry out the impeachment trial, does not rely necessarily on any sort of legal standard. The Supreme Court vests that, purely in Congress and not with them. Because they noted that this is a political question. So number one, has Trump committed an impeachable crime? The answer is it is entirely dependent on the Senate and how they vote. This is what I mean when I say that impeachment is a political decision. If the Senate convicts, then yes, Trump has committed an impeachable crime. And that's the definition of whether the crime is an impeachable crime, is whether the Congress decides if it is or isn't, or the Senate. This is because impeachment doesn't necessarily require criminal behavior. So that's why, it's not like a criminal proceeding. If we look for evidence supporting this assertion, we can look back to the drafting of the Constitution, which indicate behavior supporting impeachment, such as high crimes and misdemeanors. And these they don't need to be crimes. if we go back to to give it some context, right? When they were writing the Constitution in the Federalist Paper 65, Hamilton famously wrote, "The subjects of the Senate's impeachment jurisdiction are those offenses," I'm quoting, "those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust." So that's in, Hamilton, one of our founding fathers' view, is the basis for impeachment. And I think abuse or violation of public trust definitely applies here, in my view. So I think it is very credible for the House to move to impeachment. And if they convict, I also find that very credible. So does Trump's incitement of the Capitol insurrection meet the standard? I believe yes. However, it is 100% up to the Senate to make that decision after conducting a trial.
Right.
Second, what arguments for and against impeachment will the two sides bring forward? So as we discussed before, those against impeachment will cite the futility of bringing an impeachment trial against the president who's already left office. And the other argument would be to prevent future divisiveness to this country, which I find to be a little bit like of an excuse at this point. Arguments for war in favor of impeachment is everything I mentioned earlier: to establish the country's one ruled by law, no one's above the law; to establish political precedents on when government officials, especially a president, can be impeached; and most importantly, a conviction would mean that Trump would be disqualified from holding future positions in the government. Third, in terms of the proceedings, what will they look like logistically, right? Is that what one of your questions was?
Yes.
So I think you're wanting to know, like, what would the proceedings look like? What would they look like logistically? How long would the entire process take?
Right.
Let me answer the last one first.
Sure.
A long time.
Right.
Which I think would make Trump very happy, because that'll give him the oxygen he needs for his, type of personality. But, that aside, as I mentioned before, the Supreme Court affirmed in a 1993 case that impeachment is the domain of the two chambers of Congress, with the U.S. House having the right to accuse and the Senate having the sole power to try the accusation. So the Democrats want a quick Senate trial. But even though there's speculation, and I believe sources that say Mitch McConnell is considering to convict Trump this time, his wife resigned from the cabinet position. However, actions speak louder than words. And McConnell has decided not to reconvene Congress until the 19th, which is one day before Joe Biden's inauguration, which would not make a quick and speedy Senate trial like the Democrats want. So so we are looking into complications there. Still, many questions have emerged since the U.S. House of Representatives on January 13th impeached Trump, opening the door to Senate trial for inciting violence, of resurrection of the Capitol on January 6th. So practical considerations, well, first of all, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has not yet set a date for delivery of the articles of impeachment to the Senate, and the senators would be organizing a trial as they take up the new agenda for President Joe Biden at the same time. So I think they're still trying to work that out. And, that's once we get more detailed information on that, I'm happy to relay all of that to you. So with respect to this proceeding, that's where we are right now. People are making the argument saying you can't even do this. I say because there is no precedence, they can do this, especially because the Democrats will hold, the Senate as well. No president has been trialed after leaving office, right? In earlier centuries, however, two other officials were impeached and subjected to some Senate action after they resigned. So there is some precedence for this. Among the basic questions asked by this groundbreaking trial for an ex-president is, for this one, for Trump, is whether Chief Justice John Roberts would preside as he did at Trump's first impeachment a year ago. I think that's less important, but that's just what people are talking about, proceeding-wise. Many legal scholars believe a former president can be subject to trial, and even some who differ recognize that 1993 precedent in which a Mississippi federal judge, Walter Nixon, unsuccessfully challenged a Senate trial procedure in his impeachment case that could thwart a Trump appeal to federal court. There's also constitutional history and precedent that allow the Senate to try former officials, including the president, since it would be absurd if you can escape by resigning ahead of the gavel. If we go back into history, in 1876, the Senate tried the war secretary during Ulysses S. Grant's administration, but the war secretary resigned just before the US House was voting to impeach him. The Senate in this case determined that the former secretary could be tried, even though the war secretary was eventually acquitted after a lengthy trial. So that there's not plenty of precedents, but there are some precedents saying, yes, you can continue these impeachment proceedings after the official leaves the office. And in addition, the Constitution provides for removal as well as disqualification from holding office because framers were concerned about future dangerous conduct from government officials. So that's all my thoughts on that. Hopefully that's helpful to your viewers.
Yeah, super helpful. You spoke about the history and also, why this is different from the first time. Well, I guess a notable difference from the first impeachment is sort of the response from the Republican side. Well, I guess the key question, the sort of the most important question we have in mind is, will there be enough Republican support in the Senate to convict Trump? You mentioned, McConnell seems to be sort of softening a little bit, and we have Romney and other senators who are sort of vocally speaking against Trump. So what will be your guess and predictions on that?
Okay, so this is I think this is an evolving question. If you asked me this 3 days ago, let's just say, I would have said no. I think you can get to 10 senators, Republican senators. I don't think you can get to 17 is what you would need, plus all the Democrats, which I think you would probably get. But then now hearing McConnell come out, well, not come out, but sources coming out saying McConnell is considering, impeaching, voting to convict Trump. And McConnell has a strong coalition inside the Republican, with the Senate. So I think if he votes that way, many will follow. And that's just my opinion. Plus, we have senators like Mitt Romney, who was the only brave Republican voting, against his party last time in the impeachment. You have the Maine senator, Lisa, who
Susan Collins.
I'm sorry, Susan Collins, who says that she finds this behavior unacceptable. So it sounds like there's a break in ranks, right. And this time I think it's different because he's an outgoing president, right? I think McConnell's alliance with Trump was one of convenience. And now, not to be too cynical, but now that Trump is no longer a useful idiot, as some, editorials would say, I think it doesn't make sense for McConnell to stick by him and go down in history as, a senator supporting a president that, incited this insurrection. So I feel more positive this time that we might get the conviction, also purely out of self-interest purposes. Like I said, you have all these Republicans hoping to run in 2024, and if Trump decides to run, that's it. He's the one that's going to run most likely. So I think there's incentive also there for senators who have that ambition to run for president to say, okay, maybe I'm going to vote to remove him this time, to convict, and not to remove, but to convict, and so I'm quite hopeful for that.
Okay. Yeah, let's just wait and see. But thank you so much. Thank you, Angel. This is such a helpful conversation, and we will make sure to see you back in 2 weeks when there are other topics popping up that are of interest. I'm sure there will be.
Yeah, absolutely. Never a boring day with Trump.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Angel. Have a good rest of your afternoon.